Hello and welcome to today's thought for the day. My name's Laura and I'm one of the clergy here with Portishead Church of England. Today I'm going to be reflecting upon Luke chapter 24 verses 35 to 48. Now I wonder if you enjoy a good ghost story. The telling and hearing of ghost stories is perhaps one of those rites of passages that teenagers often go through on their first night away from home with friends. But how many of us have claimed to actually see one? Well, in the UK, the number is remarkably high. 3 in 5 people have said they've seen a ghost in their lifetime, with 40% claiming that their pet has seen one too. Personally, I love a good ghost story. They seem to capture and express beliefs that we're otherwise normally too afraid to explore. But one familiar storyline, which often emerges in stories such as these, is the idea that ghosts remain because of unfinished business. For some reason or another, the deceased is unable to rest because they've become stuck. A thread's become loose, and so they enlist the help of those in the real world to help find some kind of redemption or closure. But the problem is they're a ghost, and they're a bit stuck as to the methods they use to communicate their needs. So instead of sharing what's gone on, they end up scaring or cursing those that they encounter, often repeating the trauma that they've experienced. And it's a ghost in our reading, which the disciples think they've seen when Jesus appears to them. To be fair, Jesus does look different, and he appears to them just in their midst as they stood there. John mentions that the doors were shut, leading us to think that maybe Jesus is a ghost after all. I mean, how else could he appear? But Jesus isn't like the ghosts we hear about at sleepovers or watch late at night. The apparition is no apparition at all, no spectre in their imaginations. Jesus has flesh and bones, hands and feet. There's no unfinished business here for Jesus. He's already set out to do all that was asked of him. Rather, the unfinished business sits with the disciples. They're the ones who are afraid, repeating past behaviours and hiding in a room so they can't be found. So often, our experiences from the past impact on how we experience the present. We assume that how things were must now be the case, because what else do we have to compare our experiences to? The disciples' past experience told them that Jesus was dead, and so it makes perfect sense that they thought that it was a ghost in front of them. But the thing is that they were told that he was alive. And for some of them stood there, they had even just encountered him on the road to Emmaus. And so we can see, it often takes a while for a new way to see the world to sink in, and for the present reality to become one that we can believe in. And that's because when we're afraid, it's scientifically shown that as human beings, we default to seeing things in binary or dualistic terms. So yes or no, in or out, dead or alive. And we begin to create rules for ourselves and others so that we're protected from the fear and anxiety which surrounds us. But the reality is that when we begin to think like this, we set ourselves up as being separate to those around us. Like the disciples, we hide ourselves away from the world, scared of what it might do or what might befall us. So here the disciples are, in the midst of their trauma, when Jesus comes and interrupts this cycle which is permeating the room, their minds and their bodies. And Jesus declares a new way of thinking, of feeling, of being, a way of peace. And not only this, but Jesus opens up the possibility of both of earth and of heaven, both different and the same, both in this world but not of this world. He opens up the possibility of seeing things differently and through a perspective other than our own. We can't see both unless we've really taken the time to slow down and understand the situation or people in front of us, the alternative viewpoints and understandings. Being recently married has certainly taught me a thing or two about this. For a long time, it was just my worldview, and I was always right. I had the freedom to think, do and make decisions as I wanted. But now life is shared. Financial decisions are shared, holiday destinations, childcare and chores, what types of pasta or pizza and butter are all up for negotiation. And it requires me to see how a viewpoint completely different to my own has the possibility of being a gift. And sometimes I don't want to give up the real butter for the margarine, and that's okay, because sometimes it's a case of both and. Anyone who has ever lived with deep friendships and deep relationships knows what I mean. When Jesus makes himself known amongst us as he did the disciples, he offers us a gift, the gift of reconciliation. When we're able to embody a position other than our own, we're able to witness to this saving work. Repentance takes on a whole new meaning. It's no longer simply an admission of guilt, but an action which allows us to see through the lens of another, our neighbour that we've wronged, or a God we've neglected or failed to believe in. When we allow ourselves to encounter Jesus, repentance and forgiveness stops being about what is right and what is wrong, who's in and who's out, and becomes about a desire to reach out and walk together with one another in a newly shared future which is fashioned together. It becomes a space where we can both give and receive hospitality from one another. When we begin to live out of this new way of being in the world, as it did with the disciples, might not recognise what we're doing or who we are, because it's an embodiment of a kingdom they may have never seen before. It may say we're wrong or deluded. We've seen a little of this reaction recently to Archbishop Justin Welby's sermon given on Easter Sunday. He said this: "This season is why there are such ethical questions about sending asylum seekers overseas. The details are for politics and politicians, but the principles must stand. The judgment of God, it cannot. It cannot carry the weight of the resurrection justice, of life conquering death. It cannot carry the weight of the resurrection that was first to the least valued, for it privileges the rich and the strong." In so many ways, the rejection of asylum seekers is a way of an old way of thinking. We can either do this or that, but either full or we're empty, broken or fixed. You're either a refugee or you can contribute. But Jesus says in his resurrection body, bearing his wounds, that it is through our brokenness that we're able to heal others. In God's kingdom, there is always room for one more. In God's kingdom, it is the other who heals us. In God's kingdom, it is a refugee who is a source of salvation for others. Luke teaches us in this passage that every time we come to break bread, as Jesus broke bread and ate fish with his friends, we enter into a new way of seeing Jesus for who he really is. And we're able to know him as the disciples knew him. And it is in this meal that our anxious hearts are filled with peace, as a new reality is revealed and experienced. In this meal, there is no more black and white, male or female, in or out, past or future. There is only the now, where all are gathered together, and there is always room for one more.